The old courthouse stood tall and imposing on that chilly autumn morning. Inside courtroom 237, 12-year-old Marcus Johnson felt his heart pounding against his chest like a drum. His chocolate-brown hands were sweating as he gripped the edges of his oversized second-hand suit jacket. A gift from the church donation box that still smelled faintly of mothballs. This wasn't Marcus's first time here. The familiar scent of wood polish and fear filled his nostrils as he watched other kids come and go before Judge Sarah Martinez. Some left crying, others with angry faces, a few with relieved smiles. Marcus counted the cracks in the wooden floor beneath his feet, trying to distract himself from the weight of the crumpled note in his pocket. Miss Thompson, his public defender, kept glancing at him with worried eyes. She was nice enough, but Marcus could tell she was overworked and tired. Dark circles under her eyes matched the coffee stains on her wrinkled blazer. She had tried to talk to him earlier, but Marcus had stayed quiet, just like the last 2 times he'd been caught shoplifting from Mr. Parker's convenience store. But today was different. Today, Marcus had a plan. He watched Judge Martinez carefully from his seat. She wasn't like the other judges he'd seen on TV. There were laugh lines around her eyes, and sometimes she smiled at the kids before her, even the ones in trouble. Her black robe didn't seem as scary as it should have been, maybe because she wore a bright purple scarf around her neck, the same color as the flowers his little sister Sarah loved to draw. The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. Case number 2347, Marcus Johnson. Third offense, petty theft. Marcus's legs felt like jelly as he stood up. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday's school lunch. A few people turned to look at him, and he felt his cheeks burn with shame. But the hunger wasn't what worried him most. It was the thought of his 3 younger siblings at home, probably just as hungry as he was. Behind him, he could hear the quiet murmurs of other people in the courtroom. The whispers felt like tiny needles on his skin. He knew what they were thinking. Just another troublemaker, another black kid stealing, another lost cause. But they didn't know. They didn't understand. The note in his pocket felt heavier with each step he took toward the judge's bench. His mother's face flashed in his mind. How thin she'd become since the cancer, how her beautiful smile had faded, how she tried to hide her tears when she thought the children were asleep. Marcus squeezed the paper tighter, gathering every ounce of courage he could find in his young body. Judge Martinez peered down at him over her reading glasses, her face unreadable. "Marcus Johnson," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "we meet again." What happened next would change everything, not just for Marcus, but for everyone in that courtroom. Judge Martinez rifled through Marcus's file, her experienced eyes scanning each page with careful attention. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she studied the photographs from his latest shoplifting incident. 2 loaves of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a package of bologna. Not exactly the typical items a 12-year-old would steal for thrills. The security camera footage from Mr. Parker's store showed something that caught her eye. While other young shoplifters usually went for candy or sodas, Marcus had headed straight for the bread aisle. His movements were deliberate, almost desperate. She watched as he carefully tucked the food into his backpack, his eyes constantly darting to the prices on the shelves, as if calculating something in his head. Marcus sat quietly now, different from the angry boy who'd stood before her 2 months ago. Gone was the defiant tilt of his chin, replaced by a weariness that seemed too heavy for his young shoulders. His school uniform hung loose on his frame, and dark circles shadowed his eyes, signs that didn't match the troublemaker label others had so quickly pinned on him. Ms. Thompson, his public defender, cleared her throat. "Your Honor, if I may." But before she could continue, she was interrupted by a small commotion at the back of the courtroom. A young woman had slipped in, trying to be invisible. She wore a hospital bracelet and a colorful headscarf that couldn't quite hide her lack of hair. Marcus's mother. She leaned against the wall, clearly exhausted but determined to be there for her son. The judge noticed how Marcus's shoulders tensed when he heard his mother's quiet coughing. His hands, which had been fidgeting with the hem of his jacket, suddenly became still. There was a story here, one that wasn't captured in the sterile pages of his case file. Previous hearings had painted Marcus as a repeat offender, a statistic waiting to happen. But today, Judge Martinez saw something else. She noticed how he positioned himself to block his mother from view, as if trying to shield her from the harsh fluorescent lights. How his eyes kept darting to the clock, probably worried about his siblings at home. The social worker's report sat unopened on her desk. Inside were the usual checkboxes and evaluations, but they couldn't capture the quiet dignity in how Marcus carried himself, or the protective glances he cast toward his weakened mother. These were the details that 20 years on the bench had taught Judge Martinez to notice, the silent stories that existed between the lines of official reports. As she prepared to begin the formal proceedings, she caught a glimpse of something in Marcus's pocket, a piece of paper he kept touching, like a talisman. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and in them she saw not guilt or defiance, but a desperate kind of hope that made her pause. Something was about to happen in her courtroom, something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about this case. The courtroom fell silent as Marcus suddenly pushed back his chair. The wooden legs scraped against the floor, making a sound that echoed through the quiet chamber. Miss Thompson reached for his arm, but Marcus was already moving, his feet carrying him forward with a determination that surprised everyone present. His heart thundered in his chest as he walked toward Judge Martinez's bench. The distance seemed to stretch forever, past the wooden barrier, past the startled court clerk, past everything that had held him back before. The crumpled note in his hand felt damp with sweat, but he gripped it tighter, knowing it was his only chance. The bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, started forward with a stern expression. His hand automatically moved to his belt, but something in Marcus's face made him hesitate. This wasn't the usual disruption he dealt with. There was no anger in the boy's movement, no defiance in his step, just pure desperation mixed with hope. Judge Martinez raised her hand slightly, stopping Officer Rodriguez in his tracks. She'd seen thousands of defendants in her years on the bench, but something about this moment felt different. The boy's eyes held a story that needed telling, and sometimes, she knew, justice required listening more than speaking. From her elevated position, she could see Marcus trembling. His shoulders were so thin under that oversized jacket, and his shoes were worn almost through the soles. But his chin was lifted, and his eyes never left hers as he approached. The other people in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath collectively, waiting to see what would happen next. Behind him, his mother had straightened up against the wall, her hand pressed to her mouth. The morning light streaming through the high windows caught the tears on her cheeks. Even Mr. Parker, the store owner who'd pressed charges, leaned forward in his seat, his earlier anger replaced by curiosity. Marcus stopped exactly 3 steps from the bench. He looked up at Judge Martinez, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with hands that shook but didn't falter, he held out the note. It was written on a piece of torn notebook paper, the blue lines visible through his careful handwriting. Judge Martinez found herself reaching for it before protocol could remind her not to. There was something in the boy's expression, a mix of fear and fierce love, that transcended the usual boundaries of her courtroom. As her fingers touched the paper, she saw what no one else could, the traces of tears that had dried on its creased surface. Judge Martinez unfolded the note carefully, smoothing out its creases. The handwriting was neat but rushed, as if the words couldn't come out fast enough. As she began to read, the busy sounds of the courtroom faded away, replaced by the weight of Marcus's words. "Dear Judge Martinez," the note began, "I know stealing is wrong. My mama taught me better than that, but sometimes being right isn't as important as keeping your family alive." The judge's hands tightened on the paper as she continued reading. Marcus explained how his mother's cancer diagnosis had changed everything 6 months ago. The medical bills had eaten through their savings, and then their rent money. His mother still went to work at the diner during the day and cleaned offices at night, pushing through the exhaustion of chemotherapy because they had no other choice. Sarah is 7, Tommy is 5, and baby Rose just turned 3, Marcus had written. They don't understand why Mama's too tired to cook anymore, or why her hair fell out. They just know they're hungry. Last week, Tommy cried himself to sleep because his stomach hurt so bad. I promised myself that would never happen again. The note detailed how Marcus would skip his own meals at school, saving his free lunch to take home to his siblings, how he tried mowing lawns and collecting cans for recycling. But it wasn't enough. The local food bank had helped, but their supplies were limited, and the forms required an adult signature. I tried to get a real job, the note continued, but nobody wants to hire a 12-year-old. Mr. Parker's store was the only place I could reach on foot that had enough food to fill 3 hungry stomachs. I know it was wrong to steal, but watching my little sister divide one slice of bread between her dolls because she's too hungry to sleep, that felt worse. At the bottom of the page, Marcus had written something that made Judge Martinez's throat tight. I'm not asking you to let me go. I'm asking you to help me find a better way to keep my family alive, because if you send me away, there will be nobody left to take care of them, while Mama fights to stay alive. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier as Judge Martinez looked up from the note. She saw Marcus standing there, his shoulders straight despite the tears running down his face. Behind him, his mother had slid down the wall to sit on the bench, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other clutching her headscarf. The truth had finally come out, and it was more heartbreaking than anyone in that courtroom had imagined. Judge Martinez couldn't sleep that night. Marcus's note had stirred something in her, and at dawn, she made some calls. By 8 a.m., she was walking through the Johnson family's apartment building, where the elevator was perpetually broken and the hallways smelled of old carpet and despair. The social worker, Mrs. Chen, accompanied her as they climbed 6 flights of stairs. Both women were dressed in casual clothes, trying to be as unobtrusive as possible. They reached apartment 6D, where the doorbell hung loose from its wires. The door was opened by Sarah, Marcus's 7-year-old sister, her braids neat despite her worn pajamas. Inside, the apartment was spotlessly clean but desperately empty. The kitchen told the story Marcus's note had hinted at. A single box of crackers sat on the counter, and the refrigerator hummed hollowly, containing only a half-empty jug of water and some ketchup packets. On the table, homework papers were spread out, weighted down by a library book about caring for cancer patients. In the living room, Tommy and Rose were playing quietly with a tattered deck of cards. Their eyes lit up at the sight of visitors, perhaps hoping they'd brought food. The walls were covered with children's artwork, bright, hopeful pictures that stood in stark contrast to the reality of their situation. Marcus's mother, Diana Johnson, emerged from the bedroom, tying her headscarf with trembling hands. Her hospital bracelet caught the morning light. Despite her illness, she carried herself with dignity, apologizing for not having anything to offer their unexpected guests. Judge Martinez watched as Mrs. Chen examined the apartment's food situation, utility bills, and medical documents spread across the kitchen counter. The evidence was overwhelming. Here was a family doing everything right, but still drowning. Diana's medical insurance had maxed out months ago, and her pride had kept her from asking for more help than she already had. In Marcus's room, which he shared with Tommy, Judge Martinez found stacks of library books about cooking, budgeting, and taking care of sick people. His school backpack contained carefully divided portions of his free school lunch, wrapped in napkins, proof of his desperate attempt to feed his siblings. The truth of Marcus's note was written in every corner of that apartment. In the empty cupboards, in the carefully rationed toilet paper, in the thin blankets that couldn't quite keep out the cold. But it was also written in the love that filled every space. The hand-drawn "Get Well Soon" cards taped to Diana's bedroom door, the perfectly maintained homework folders, the way the children worked together to keep their home running. Back in her chambers, Judge Martinez worked late into the evening, making phone calls and pulling strings she'd gathered over 20 years on the bench. Her clerk watched in amazement as the usually formal judge transformed into a force of nature, refusing to end her day until she had solutions in place. The next morning, the Johnson family stood before her in a nearly empty courtroom. Marcus held his siblings' hands, trying to be brave as the judge cleared her throat to deliver her ruling. But this wasn't going to be an ordinary sentence. "Marcus Johnson," she began, her voice firm but gentle, "this court has reviewed your case thoroughly. While the law is clear about theft, it's also clear about justice. Today, we're going to try something different." She outlined her plan, watching hope slowly dawn on their tired faces. First, she'd arranged for the family to be immediately enrolled in the county's emergency food assistance program. A local food bank would deliver groceries weekly, no paperwork required. Mr. Parker, the store owner, had agreed to drop the charges in exchange for Marcus helping at the store on weekends, with pay. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. She contacted the hospital's social services department, connecting Diana with a cancer support program that would cover her remaining treatments. A local church group had volunteered to provide transportation to medical appointments and help with housekeeping. For Marcus and his siblings, she'd arranged spots in the community center's after-school program, ensuring they'd have supervised care and hot meals while their mother was at treatment. A tutoring service had offered free sessions to help Marcus catch up on the schoolwork he'd missed while trying to be a parent to his siblings. Instead of punishment, Judge Martinez declared, "This court orders you to accept help, to attend school regularly, to participate in the mentoring program I've arranged, and to let the adults around you shoulder some of the burden you've been carrying." Diana Johnson broke down in tears, but for the first time in months, they were tears of relief. Marcus stood straighter, the weight of his family's survival finally lifting from his young shoulders. Even little Rose seemed to understand something important was happening, as she reached up to pat her big brother's cheek. Judge Martinez wasn't finished. She had one more surprise that would change everything for this struggling family. 6 months later, the same courtroom witnessed a very different scene. Marcus Johnson stood before Judge Martinez again, but this time he wasn't alone. His family filled the first row, and his mother's smile lit up the room. The chemotherapy was working, her color had returned, and wisps of new hair peeked out from under her bright headscarf. Marcus pulled out his latest report card with steady hands. Straight as gleamed across the page, a remarkable turnaround from his previous struggling grades. His weekends at Mr. Parker's store had turned into a real job, with the store owner treating him like a son rather than a former thief. The same security cameras that once caught him stealing now showed him helping elderly customers carry their groceries. Sarah, Tommy, and Rose bounded with energy, their hollow cheeks now full and healthy. The after-school program had become their second home, complete with friends, homework help, and dependable meals. Sarah had even started a little club where older kids read to younger ones, inspired by how Marcus had always read to her. Diana's eyes welled with tears as she shared her good news. Her latest scans showed the cancer was in remission. The support network Judge Martinez had put in place meant she could focus on healing without worrying about her children going hungry. The church group had become like family, and the community center staff treated her kids as their own. Mr. Parker stood up to speak, his voice gruff with emotion. He talked about how Marcus had transformed from a desperate child into a responsible young man, how his story had inspired the community to start a food assistance program for other struggling families. The boy who once stole from his store was now helping him develop a system to identify and help other families in crisis. Judge Martinez listened to each testimony with a full heart. Her unconventional ruling had done more than save one family. It had sparked a movement. Other judges were now looking deeper into juvenile cases, searching for the stories behind the crimes. The local news had picked up the story, leading to increased funding for family support services. As the hearing concluded, Marcus handed the judge another note. This one wasn't crumpled or tear-stained. It was a thank you card, signed by dozens of people whose lives had been touched by his story. Inside, in his now confident handwriting, were the words that summed up everything. You didn't just save me that day. You taught me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask for help.